right, today I want to talk about why some people are jerks, mean, bullies, defensive, all the time. I'm not talking about the single instances or every once in a while where all of us as humans act in ways we regret, ways we wish we didn't. That's part of being human. We make up for it, we apologize, we reflect on what happened to make us that way or to trigger us like that. But I'm talking about lifelong. Someone who you've always known, they always get really defensive, or they're always a jerk, or they're always a bully, and they always have been. Why? It's weird and it's interesting how some people develop into those personalities. And a great quote to start out with in this topic is, to become the monster, you first need to become the victim. And that's a quote from Darrell Hammond's book, God, If You're Not Up There, I'm, with the F word at the end. And it's when he's talking to one of his doctors, a doctor who helped him a lot later on in his life. And first of all, it's a fantastic personal account of Darrell's own terrible childhood. I mean, I don't like to compare one childhood to the other. Regardless of what happened, if your childhood affected you in a way that carried on into adulthood in a not a good way, then that matters. That matters regardless. But in the totality of physical things and what was done to him as a child by his mother and his father, who didn't do much to intervene, it's worthy of a book. And it's an amazing story of his childhood, how that affected him, how he coped with alcohol and cutting and other ways of acting out, and then into recovery, into the healing journey. And it's a raw, it's unfiltered book, and it also has a follow-up documentary that he did. I think it's just called The Darrell Hammond Story. Cracked Up is the subtitle, Cracked Up. Fantastic documentary, fantastic book. Let's get back to the topic though. To become a monster, you first need to be a victim. And what does that mean? I think we've all heard the term, hurt people hurt people. Or a long form of saying that is, people who are hurt themselves will hurt and do hurt other people. Now, we're excluding the small percentage of people who are legit psychopaths, or the almost 100% of the people in Washington, D.C. who are legit sociopaths. We're not talking about the fringe that have a legit, maybe chemical imbalance. Your abuser, your narcissistic spouse, parent, whoever it was, very likely, and I would almost say 100%, were themselves treated negatively in their childhood. People aren't born this way, again, unless you're that fringe element, psychopath, sociopath. People aren't born this way. What happens to us in childhood, for better or for worse, affects us and carries on with us in our adult life. How we manage how we were treated in childhood carries on with us into adult life. And it often goes something like this. If you have a parent who's constantly berating you, telling you what you're doing is wrong or everything you do breaks, and even if they don't say those things, but the treatment you get and the tone and the look of contempt is just repetitive over your formative years, over and over and over and over, until it becomes a decade and a half, possibly 2 decades of that. When we're a kid, our minds are very smart, but we don't know how to use them yet. So when it's impossible for us as kids because of the survival instinct of basically every organism, it's impossible for us to think that there is something wrong with our caretaker, with our caregiver. So in an unconscious way of deductive reasoning, our little minds go, well, if the problem can't be with them, if something's not wrong with them, and they're treating me like this, the only other possible solution is for something to be wrong with me. And we start to internalize that. And we do that over enough time, and we're continued to be treated this way. That becomes our inner critic. And how many of us have carried that on into adult life? It's awesome. It's deep sarcasm there. It's not awesome. It makes life extremely difficult carrying around a harsh inner critic. And I'm very empathetic to that. I've had one most of my adult life, definitely from my childhood. And only now in the last few years am I being able to address that, going through therapy, watching lots of YouTube videos, reading lots of books, going in groups. So our child minds get stuck in that pattern. And we carry that on through our teenage years, into our 20s, into our 30s. And it quickly becomes so ingrained with us that we start to believe that's who we are. So someone who had a micromanaging, berating, demeaning parent who was always looking for faults because they themselves got treated like that when they were a kid, and their only way to process that shame and that guilt and that low amount of self-love, if any, is to project it out onto other people. So when you come across someone, or someone who's always been defensive, always been mean, always been a bully, number one, let's exercise our own boundaries with these. We don't deserve poor treatment. We aren't rug mats, okay? We have our own boundaries if we interact with these people on a regular basis, if we can't remove them from our lives. But hopefully this gives an understanding for yourself in the ways why do we do the things we do? And why is it, especially when we get into that inner critic voice of why do I always do that? Why do I always say things like that? Why am I always like this? And that harsh shaming and that judgment on ourselves. Understanding is half of the journey. Just realizing those moments where you're like, oh, okay, so that's why I acted like this today and in the past and in the past. That's why I usually say things like that in the past. Okay, now I get it. That understanding is really powerful when you have those moments of clarity in your journey. It's an extremely powerful moment, and I love it. I love it when I'm reading something or watching a video on so many of the great content creators, understanding one more thing about recovering from this. It's fantastic. And so back to how we develop these ways of behavior for people who were traumatized. And again, I'm not excusing anyone's behavior, how you were treated. It's not okay. It wasn't okay. Okay, we're not excusing anyone's behavior, especially as adults. And I'm not excusing our own behavior. I was a bully in school. I was mean to other kids. Okay? And now I know exactly why I did that. I don't feel good about any of those instances that I did that. But having this understanding later on in life gives a little bit more empathy and a little bit more sympathy to the situation. I now know why I did that. Because in my home, it was a hurtful, awful place. And my only way to process that was to project it out into the world. Because when we are treated like that by one of our caregivers at such an early age, there's a hierarchy of relationships that we have to adhere to. Because again, there's a survival instinct in us as kids. We're just a little ball of goo with arms and legs when we're first born. I mean, there's without a doubt that we need people to help us and to care for us. I'd argue until like 13, 14. That's at the earliest, that if someone was forced to go out and live on their own, that I think That's the earliest it'd be possible. I'm sure there's others who have had to do it from even younger ages. But that relationship hierarchy goes like this. First, all of us, obviously our preference is a good relationship with our caregiver. And the second, if we can't have a good relationship, we'll take a bad relationship, because no relationship is basically suicide and death. And our little kid-like minds can't think of that. Can't even process not having a relationship with our caregiver or with our spouse if we're in a narcissistic relationship. It's tantamount to suicide if we even consider that. And so our little kid minds do these protective things. Be like, okay, well, if I can't have the good relationship because there's something always wrong with me by the way they're treating me, clearly that's what's going on. And our minds don't think that. They're doing this in the back processes of our minds. We're not having these thoughts as kids like, oh, because they're treating me this way, then that must mean it's true. No, that's just how our minds work as kids, as we're developing. We have smart minds, but we don't know how to use them yet. And they have to adapt. They have to adapt to these chaotic situations simply to survive. So good relationship first, bad relationship second, which is anyone who comes from a traumatic childhood, CPTSD, abuse. That's likely what you had to do to survive. So because I need to identify with the bad relationship, we become the embodiment of how we're treated, how we're spoken to, how we're looked at. And that's how we end up in that process and in that cycle of, this must just be who I am. I'm a bad person. And that's simply not true. But again, I want this to shed some light and some understanding on people you may have in your life, and maybe yourself, of where it comes from. And interject a little bit more empathy, a little bit more sympathy. Again, not to have your boundaries stepped on or your boundaries broken. We need to stand up for ourselves, and we need to learn to stand up for ourselves. That's a process in itself. But remember what I said in the video, Travel Will Not Fix You. We treat ourselves and we treat others how our parents treated us. And I find that to be true over and over and over again. And just an example of this is a jiu-jitsu practitioner and former UFC fighter, Rousimar Palhares, and a Brazilian guy. And it's widely known that he had a very traumatic childhood, okay? But when he was in the UFC in 2010, and then it repeated in 2013, he got his opponent in a leg lock. I think both of them were heel hooks. And he held on and kept cranking beyond the time that the opponent was tapping and the referee was trying to pull him off and to let go of the submission. And after it happened, got some birds. After it happened in 2013, he was let go from the UFC. Okay. People aren't born like that. When in your mind you want to hurt someone, look, Rousimar, it's not a secret of how his childhood was. And there's likely a lot of processing he needed to do at that time. I don't know how he is now. I mean, it's been 11 years since he was last in the UFC. Hopefully he's gone to therapy. He's found some people. He found some groups to process that, and isn't holding on to these submissions like he used to. But that's an example. He wasn't born like that. He felt so much internal pain. The only way to process that was to project it out into the world, unfortunately onto his opponents in a grueling submission. Heel hooks are not fun. So, in order to become the monster, you must first be the victim. That's a quote from Darrell Hammond's book. Again, I recommend it. Fantastic book. Again, the documentary Cracked Up is the documentary. Another fantastic book. Just to get an understanding of why some people act the way they do, and why you may have acted in a certain way in the past, or just last week, or even earlier today. Make amends, forgive yourself, and remember, if you're going through this stuff, your childhood, it wasn't your fault. You were raised by people who they themselves were hurt and stunted in their maturation into adulthood. Okay. And there is hope and there is healing in this recovery journey. Thanks for watching.